Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Integration Television. I'm your host, Robin Smith. Today's episode, we will be having our feature interview with Hollis Tibbetts. It's a telephone interview talking about the build versus buy question, that infamous question that keeps coming back. It started in the EDI world and has now reared its head in the middleware space. Hollis is a very engaging speaker, and Hollis has some interesting ideas that I'm sure you, our viewers, are going to enjoy. But first, the news. We're going to make this really short this month. We only have one report to bring to the table, and that is the Times of London have just put out their annual supply chain review report. This is an annual report that the Times of London puts together on the state of global supply chains. It was just released last week. It's available on our, the link will be available on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a very interesting perspective on global supply chains. So now on to our feature interview with Hollis.
Hi, and welcome to the feature interview of Integration Television. This month we have a special guest, Hollis Tibbetts, who is a leading integration expert out of Austin, Texas, the principal of Artemis Ventures, who today is going to be talking to us about this age-old discussion that seems to rear its head in the middleware space, and that is, do you build your own integration stack or do you buy it? Hollis has written a fantastic blog article, which I'm not going to reference, but we can talk about it at the very end. And it was the trigger that had us reach out to Hollis to bring him on the show. So I'm really thrilled to have Hollis here. Hollis has worked with some leading integration companies, Pervasive, Sybase, WebMethods, M7 Corporation, and Kiva Software. He's an industry expert and has authored a very large number of technology white papers. He's a feature blogger on eBizQ, and he's also a feature author on Social Media Today. So Hollis, I'd like to welcome you to our feature interview today with Integration Television, and looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you, Robin, for having me on Integration TV.
Well, you're more than welcome, and I think that today's subject is going to be one of interest to our viewers. We've had this ongoing debate over the years over build versus buy. We certainly saw it in the early years in the integration space with the first EDI translators. A lot of companies went out and tried to build their own solution, and it seems that in the middleware, it seems that in the middleware world we're facing the same debate. So, Hollis, my question to you is, why does this debate still continue? Is there something unique about this build versus buy thing that it still keeps rearing its head?
Well, Robin, there is. I remember back in the mid to late 80s when I was working in the VAX and mini computer arena, and a lot of people back then used to talk about building their own relational database or their own file management system rather than buying a product like Oracle. And today, nobody thinks about buying or building their own relational database. Everybody buys one. But 20 years after the EDI wave and 10 or 15 years after the integration EAI wave, people still talk about building their own integration stack. And what is fundamentally different about integration versus products like the relational database is that integration is often an afterthought. People would have to make a database decision right up front, but integration is something that people try often to deal with after they buy their applications, and as a result they don't consider long-term implications. They think of integration as a point-to-point type of a problem that can be addressed in little tiny pieces. And what they don't realize is that they're creating a long-term, expensive problem for themselves.
See, now this is very interesting that you bring this up, because really what you're talking about there is people approaching integration from the single silo approach or the single silo solution. And what you're saying is really that people should step back, do that more holistic view of the way data flows. And if they do that, then the build versus buy debate has a tendency to go away. I certainly know in our experience, I've seen integration in many companies be an afterthought. They choose their core product, and then, oh well, how do we get data in and how do we get data out? It seems to be the common theme. So that's, to me, that's very interesting. Is there in the process of deciding whether you build yourself or whether you buy an off-the-shelf product, to me, obviously, there are cost implications here. From your experience and from your point of view, are there beyond the upfront costs of buying, are there hidden costs and why is cost not really analyzed as an effective piece of the conversation?
Well, cost is a huge issue, and people who engage in building integration they tremendously underestimate the cost of not only building, but more importantly, managing and supporting and scaling up and scaling out. All of those costs are underestimated, often by a factor of 10 or more.
That's huge. So can you elaborate a little bit on scaling out, because that's interesting to me, because I think a lot of people go in and they say, I'm going to build the integration flow, but I think the scaling out has bigger implications. Can you just elaborate there?
Oh, the scaling out is the thing that people typically don't pay attention to. People think about scaling up, which is, more volume of data or more volume of transaction. But scaling out is the true hidden cost that people don't think about, because they think about integration as being point-to-point. So they buy a new application. Let's pretend it's Salesforce.com. So they build a point-to-point interface between their customer support database and Salesforce.com. But scaling out means that that's how they end. Now they realize that they need to interface Salesforce with their accounting system, so that once a prospect turns into a customer, that an invoice is automatically generated. And then they need to interface it with other systems. And as they start building more and more interfaces to different systems, that is the scaling out that I'm talking about. And because of that, they end up with this big tangled mess that is expensive.
Interesting. Now, I would think also that in that scaling out, as you build these interfaces, you're not going to be building your test and your production environment. So I guess there's a cost there as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It's for every time you have to do one of these, there is a whole process that you have to go through to build it and to test it. And keep in mind that in today's SaaS environment, most of these SaaS vendors are updating their interfaces between 2 and 10 times a year. So every time I interface with a new system, I have to continually be checking to make sure that my software still works.
Interesting. I had never thought of looking at it from the perspective of how often the APIs that the SaaS vendors have are actually changing, because if you come at integration from an EDI perspective, EDI standards and the documents, that say the retailers put out, they don't change that often. So there are clearly business implications here that we can get into discussing in terms of that build versus buy. So certainly cost, and anybody who's a CFO or a controller that's listening to this conversation, I mean, it goes strictly beyond the CapEx spend. But are there business implications to this whole process of how how you approach this? And you know, you talked earlier about the breaking down the single silo solution. Clearly, in the build versus buy, there's got to be some business imperatives that would sway the argument.
Well, absolutely, and there are some very, very straightforward tactical business issues, and then there are some seriously important strategic business issues which the build versus buy debate touches on.
Okay.
The simplest, go ahead.
Very, very interesting. Can you elaborate on each one of those? Because I think there's some, the business, the strategic and the tactical are sometimes things that people don't think about.
Well, from a very, very straightforward perspective, here is the simplest tactical one. The SaaS vendors update their interfaces on a continual, regular basis, and it could be as simple as your integration just stops working and you don't know why. And if, for example, I have an integration between Salesforce and my accounting system for generating invoices, if that suddenly stops working because one of those two vendors updates their interface and my IT department wasn't checking for that, then all of a sudden my quote to cash cycle has been broken, and
yeah,
that impacts revenue.
Yep, for sure, for sure. Or they've outsourced it to a third-party programming house that are not available because they don't have the in-house, team. So yeah, for sure.
So that is just a very simple example of just what I'll call a tactical business issue that most companies are not prepared to deal with when they build their own integration stacks.
Yeah, yeah.
Another one is issues, things like failover. What happens if there, for some reason the machine that is running the integration stack fails? Do they have a transparent failover system? Have they dealt with the issue of transactions or data disappearing because the machine crashes? Those are serious programming issues that are difficult to manage. But a lot of times, not only do you have to make sure that none of the data or none of the transactions disappear because of a machine crash, but oftentimes the order that transactions occur in is important. So how is that order maintained in the event of some sort of a system failure? And those are issues that are, complicated to implement if you do it yourself. But if you buy it, that's done for you.
So it's really all of the what-ifs around the integration scenarios that you're talking about. Are there implications in the build versus buy from an audit perspective?
Well, absolutely, because from an audit perspective, and anytime you have to deal with that type of a scenario, audit tracking and all of the security that has to be built into the system, that is something that is provided for by the integration vendor. But that infrastructure would typically need to be repeated and reapplied or reused every time you build your own integration piece. And a lot of times that just may not be shareable or might not be very shareable code. So you end up with having to you end up with, boy, I'm making a mess out of this one. But you end up with yet another layer of programming complexity that you have to build and manage yourself in order to make sure that you can have auditability and comprehensive security. And if you're dealing in an environment with industry regulations or governmental regulations, that's a very, very important thing to deal with.
No, this is interesting. So clearly it's you know, if I can use an analogy, it's the iceberg analogy, is that the actual integration flow is really the top of the iceberg. It's what's underneath that you don't really see, or you don't think about, all those what ifs, that if one were to properly assess in an integration, from an integration perspective,
I think
clearly you're leaning towards the buy side.
Yeah, I believe when you talk about the 90-10, where only 10% of the iceberg is above the water, I believe that about 90% of the effort in doing integration work is invisible under the water. Even things like monitoring the interfaces to make sure that the connections are up and running. All of those things are things which are not typically seen. When people think about integration, they only think about connecting one interface to the other. They don't think about scaling up. They don't think about scaling out. They don't think about monitoring. They don't think about auditing. They don't think about security. They don't think about persistence. They don't think about the order that messages are delivered. They don't think about APIs changing. They don't think about any of those things. And that's all invisible.
So these are all really good takeaways then, that both from a strategic and a tactical perspective, if one is making the assessment, do I build it myself? And you may have a program that says, oh, this is really simple, it's just point to point, I can do it. These takeaways, I think, are very important in that. But
there's one thing. There's one thing that I think is even more important than all of those other issues combined, though.
What's that?
And that is what I'll call it just agility for doing business. If you think about the very purpose of data, the very purpose of data is, and the very purpose of applications, you know, it's data that makes applications valuable. And the more you connect data and the more you connect applications, the more you share between applications, the more valuable all of that becomes. For instance, you know, Salesforce.com is a wonderful product, but if I'm able to enrich my Salesforce.com screens with data from my accounting systems, with data from interactions in the customer support arena, even with interactions from social media, if I can bring all of that together for my account managers to see all in one screen, I make Salesforce.com more valuable to the business. I make the business more competitive. Businesses run on applications and they run on data, and I need to link applications and share data to make my businesses more competitive. And what integration platforms do is they make that sharing of data and that linking of applications fast, rapid, quick. And that makes for an agile organization that's able to capitalize on the full value of their applications and the full value of their data. And if I rely on a hand-built architecture, that is going to be a rigid and slow to implement architecture and difficult to change. And I'm not going to be able to match the agility of my competitors that have purchased modern, you know, services-based integration stacks.
Yep. No, I think that's a very, very good point that you make, and I think of the company who wants to take the approach of building themselves, and really they can't possibly enjoy the input and the experience of all of the companies that have gone out and invested in off the shelf, because when you buy an off-the-shelf product, you're getting a collective experience there. But I think that the parallel there is that when you build, you only see what you want to see, whereas when you buy, you're really tapping into a much wider audience's experience. So I think that's incredibly valuable. The other thing that, to me, that comes to mind in this discussion is that at that high level of integration and being able to use and leverage an off-the-shelf product, you are, and then bringing data in from the disparate sources, you're now able to start looking at data as a corporate asset, which I think is what you were talking about when you're talking about creating the value structure around bringing in more data.
Yes, I mean, you're transforming the way you look at data from a tactical application-based silo to something that is strategic and is accessible across the entire organization. And it enables that philosophy of data as a strategic corporate asset to be used everywhere.
Yep. Very good, very good. I'm going to reference your blog article for the audience, and that is a blog article that actually prompted me originally, and it's on eBizQ. It's called Building Integration Yourself, Possibly the Dumbest Idea You've Had in a Long Time. You wrote it back in November of 2011, and it's for the audience. We'll put the link up on our site for the episode. But you go into much more detail here about some of the things that people should be looking at. So Hollis, very interesting conversation. I'd like to thank you for being on today. This has been really useful. It's the first time I've had the build versus buy argument articulated so clearly. So I really thank you for that. And if we get any questions, I'll certainly be sending them along. Usually we get questions on our Twitter feed. So, Hollis, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you on, and fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin.
Great interview there with Hollis. We're going to be posting the reference to the blog article that Hollis wrote that triggered my interest in getting Hollis on integration television. As you saw, he's a pretty engaging speaker. Our phone interview was, to me, was very interesting. A couple of takeaways from that is that clearly the build versus buy argument is really swayed towards buy. It makes a lot more sense to buy because you're dealing with the collective knowledge and collective experience of people who have bought that particular product, which you don't have a chance of actually achieving when you try to build the integration stack yourselves. So I thank Hollis for being on our show today, and going forward, we're going to take a break for about a month and a half. We've got some interviews lined up that are going to take us a little bit of time to get done and put in place. So we're going to break with our schedule, and we'll come back to you later in about a month and a half's time with our third episode for 2012. In the meantime, keep the questions coming at our Twitter feed at VL Integration TV and on our Facebook page, Integration TV. So comments, questions, feedback, send them to us. We're always interested in engaging with our audience. Thank you, and see you for our next episode.